So I was thinking a little bit back on my background as we start this series of questions. There are questions that we're going to ask God if you're a Christian in the room, as long as our journey in following him. And I was thinking a bit back on just kind of my upbringing when I really met Jesus personally and began to follow him. I was a high school student and got plugged into a youth group that God was just doing some cool things through when it came to reaching other friends and really getting this kind of core group excited and following Jesus. And for me, that led into, like, as I exited high school, sticking around that church and that youth ministry and just having an opportunity to spend some time even just helping lead our middle school. So from high school and helping to lead our middle school. And so in some of my early college years, there was just this ability to continue to work with students. And that happened and continued again in my young married years. And we had some time at a church plant. One of the things that I had the ability to do was help lead a student ministry with that. And around that same time, though, there had been enough years where some of the kids that I grew up in youth ministry with that were like alongside of me, excited about following Jesus, and we kind of had this shared experience in like our sophomore year and junior year and senior year, going through the same summer camps and some of the same mission trips and participating in similar church activities along the way. Now being several years on the other side of that, it became apparent to me that not everybody was still following Jesus. Not everybody was still engaged in the church. And I began to wrestle with, like, what was it? Like, what changed? What happened? What was the reason that those students that were excited here, just some years later, it's like God was not really part of their lives in a real active way. The church definitely wasn't. And I've wrestled with that in student ministry. You know, there's this statistics that would show today that somewhere a little over half of students that are engaged, even in their high school years, in a church ministry, so a youth ministry or participating in church, somewhere in their college years that more than half stop attending church altogether. Now for some of them, maybe they hit those family years and where they start having kids, and there's a return to church for some, but not for all. And that's a wrestle for us in church leadership. Like, why is that? And I think one of the reasons that is the case is that there are oftentimes questions, a wrestle with God that maybe there wasn't a foundation in those years in church perhaps to really wrestle with some of the deeper or more challenging questions that happen later. And there became these why God moments that led not toward God, not toward a deepening faith, but for some, a rejection of the faith. There wasn't a foundation that continued onward to build upon. And so as we look at this series and these questions that we're going to ask, our hope is that isn't our story. We're going to look a bit today and then also throughout the series at some of those kind of why God questions we ask. And I think there are at least like two main categories of those questions. At one end, they're what I would call intellectual questions. So we might have why God questions that are about like our beliefs. We might read things that the Bible says and wrestle intellectually. Like, I don't see how that description of God and wrath fits what I think about God, or how do I understand what the Bible says about hell? And I don't know that I like that. How do I understand what the Bible says about things like human sexuality and creation? And we may run into intellectual why God questions. Well, why if you say this does it seem like that? All right, so there's the intellectual side of things. The other main category I'd say are you could call experiential. They're things that happen to us, like they're much more personal. And so we experience things that lead us to ask God questions. Today, we're going to look at more an experiential question of why God. It may be phrased a little bit like this. Why, if I'm following you, am I fill in the blank? Well, why God? Why, if I'm following you, am I still struggling in this season of life in this way? Why, if I'm following you, is my family having such a hard time? Why, if I'm following you, do I struggle with anxiety or depression? Why, if I'm following you, and what we'll see in this topic today, what we'll say is, why, if I'm following you, do I feel like I'm drowning? And there are times in our life where we have these very personal, they're experiential why God questions. And we're going to look at a story today in the Gospel of Matthew. One of my favorite disciples, I think, of Jesus is part of this story. His name's Peter. And if you want to turn there and get ready, in Matthew chapter 14, we're going to read through this story and then take a little bit of a look at how we would answer this why God question. Why, if I'm following you, do I feel like I'm drowning? You can read along with me in Matthew 14. You'll see that on the screen. If you have a Bible and you want to turn there as well, we're going to look at Matthew 14, starting in verse 22. And right before this, Jesus, if you were to look at what happens before, Jesus just worked this amazing miracle with his disciples around him where there was this teaching time. There were thousands of people that gathered. They didn't have enough food, and Jesus multiplies food, feeding like 5,000 people with only a handful of loaves and fish. And so Jesus' disciples have just experienced him working in this profound way, and now Jesus tells them to go get on a boat, and they're going to move somewhere. Look at verse 22. He says, immediately he, Jesus, made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. And when he dismissed the crowds, go to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat, by this time, was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And so Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand. He took hold of him, saying to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." What an amazing story. I think I say this every week, one of my favorite Bible stories, but it is really a good one. What an amazing just picture of who Jesus is and how he's working. There's a whiteboard up on the screen. I realize I'm standing in front of it. There's a scope of this story, kind of like a narrative journey of the story that I think mirrors a lot of our lives. And the way it gets started is kind of exciting for the disciples of Jesus, where they are on this like up and to the right experience in their relationship with Jesus. We're going to call this right here, I'm going to put 5,000. All right, Jesus has just fed 5,000 people. They're seeing not only the miracles of Jesus, but from their perspective, the ministry's growing, their faith in Jesus is growing. This is just a great time in following Jesus. For some of you, you can think about maybe the beginning of your journey in following Jesus, and it might have looked a lot like this, like up and to the right in your faith and your trust. It's like you were in this season where you'd said yes to following Jesus, and it's like everything just seemed to line up after that. Has that been any of your stories? It's like every prayer that you prayed, you just felt like God answered it. Every song on the radio, it was like it was a message to you. Every sermon at church was the best sermon ever. I mean, you could even drive to Cocoa Beach and you could find a parking spot right away, the perfect spot on the beach, and it wasn't crowded. And then there's a rocket that launches while you were there, and you're like, I didn't even know that's going to happen. You saw dolphins. It's like everything in your experience is this up and to the right kind of experience. Any of you have been there before, at least once, right? Okay, so me too. All right. Wouldn't it be amazing if we just lived that way forever, right? But why? Why, God? Like if you're good and I'm following you, why isn't it only always like this? But the story changed, right? So we go from feeding 5,000 to get on the boat, and then quickly there's a storm. Some of you are in a storm in your life right now. Yeah, you've had that up and to the right and that experience of God doing miraculous things, but right now, there's challenges. And you perhaps have some of those why God kind of questions. If we were to bounce back at the verses we just read in verse 24, it said the boat by this time was a long way from the land. It was beaten by the waves. That word for beaten could also be translated tormented. It's like they're just getting battered out here on the sea. They're beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, like that's almost morning, okay? So this has been just going on. They've been stuck. They're battered by the winds. You've got guys that they're used to the seas, okay? Many of these are fishermen that would fish on waters like that. They're used to the seas, but part of the challenge is, when it's this bad, it could go really bad, okay? And so they're stuck. They're being tormented, beaten by the waves. And in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus does come to them, it says, walking on the sea. The storm's raging. All right, they're stuck. Anything that you can think to do, these guys have thought to do it, to get out of this situation, and they're still stuck. Have you been there? Like, you're in a storm where, just humanly speaking, there's nothing you can do to fix it. Why is it, God, that if I'm following you, I feel like I'm drowning at times? We've been asking people for feedback on these why God questions over the past couple weeks, and there's a common one that I hear that comes up that feels very familiar even for our family. There's been a why God question when it comes to just the reality of, you probably know this by experience, but we're in like a mental health epidemic. Some of this goes back to probably some of the realities of COVID and what we experienced over the last couple of years, and our teens have gone through and life upset and upside down. But one of those why God questions that we're just consistently hearing back from people is, why am I struggling with anxiety or with depression? I've prayed. I believe you can change something, but here I am and it hasn't changed. Why? And so we're in these situations, these storms where it isn't all up and to the right, and we experience these challenges in our lives, in our own family. And I share this with permission because he's been honest with our youth ministry in sharing about his own journey. But our oldest son, Eli, we've had some rough times in the past couple of years where this has been a why God question in our family. There's been challenges with anxiety and depression that don't just change overnight. And we as parents have wrestled with, as a dad, have had seasons of just wrestle with why? Like, am I doing something wrong? Why isn't that not changing? And you guys are probably in a similar situation. What we're going to look at today are three ways that when we have these kind of experiential why God wrestles, that we don't drown in doubt. So really the idea today in our time is, how do we not drown in storms of doubt? We're going to be in these kinds of storms. How do we not drown in them? And we're going to see in Peter's story a way that there's kind of three things that stand out. And I think the first you can see on the screen is this, how to not drown in the storm of doubt. Number one, do whatever Jesus commands. Do whatever Jesus commands. Let me explain how this fits this story. Why were the disciples in the boat to begin with? Did you catch that? Jesus told them to get in the boat, right? He told them where to go to get in the boat. He didn't go with them, but they were where he told them to be. How do you not drown when you're in a storm of doubt? Start by doing what Jesus says, even if it doesn't make sense. Okay, I imagine, what if Peter in this situation, man, they're beaten by the storm and it's just not changing. What if he just bailed out of the boat? You jump out of the boat into the midst of the storm. You would laugh. That would just be a stupid solution, right? But don't we want to do that in our lives at times too? We hit the storm, and if we don't maybe have some good people around us that encourage our faith, we're just kind of tempted to bail out. But Jesus had told them to get into the boat. They were where he was supposed to be. Jesus commanded them in. Later, we saw Jesus commanded Peter to get out at a different time. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But they were where he was supposed to be. How do we not drown in storms of doubt? We have to, guys, we're not strong enough on our own. We're not smart enough to even remember things we've learned in the past. We need a reminder in a way that God's words, that Jesus commands, are in front of us at all times. We have this saying that I hope that you'll embrace called Bible before phone. All right, what would it look like if on a daily basis, before any other voice entered your life, through your smartphone, through your news feed, through your emails, through social media, what if the first voice that we listened to in the morning was God's, and we took a little bit of time to pray and to read his commands, to read his words? How do we not drown in the storm? We desperately need his truths. There are things that you may know that you just need to be reminded about because you're in the midst of it. And there are things back here that you experienced with him when it was up and to the right that you can quickly, if you're anything like me, forget all about when you're in the midst of the storm. We need his commands. It was interesting to me, too, that the way that it was said is that Jesus actually allowed a very long night of torment in that storm with them. It's the fourth watch of the night. He allowed a lot of time before he came back to them on the water. And for some of you, you're in the midst of that third watch or that fourth watch and this storm, and you can't bail out. Don't jump out of the boat because maybe he's just not done with the story yet. In Matthew's story, in Peter's story here, the way Matthew's telling it, this is still just act one of the story. He sequences the story as a part one and a part two. And right in the middle, Jesus shows up and speaks words saying, "Here I am." Look at this in verse 27. Right in the middle of this story, Matthew says immediately, Jesus spoke to them. So he's watched out. They freak out thinking he's a ghost before you make fun of him. I don't know what I would think. There's a person walking on water. Like, they're not dumb. You don't do that. So a ghost that's a pretty logical guess if you ask me, like, what in the world is happening? But then Jesus speaks and he says this, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. In and of itself, man, just the way you read it, what an encouragement. It's not a ghost, but it's I, Jesus says. They recognize his voice. It's apparent Peter does because he's going to confirm, is that really you, Jesus? Okay, in just a minute. But what's interesting, the phrasing of that, it is I in the Greek, it's worded the same place. We've talked about this before in our last series. Jesus is saying it in such a way that sounds a lot like I am, the way God says I am to his people. He's using words that Jesus tended to. In John's gospel, it's pointed out like 7 key times where Jesus has these I am kind of statements that are alluding to the fact that God, when God says, I am, Jesus is here saying the same thing, that Jesus is God in the flesh. And so they have this realization that it's not just a ghost. It's not even just Jesus, but I am. There's an I am moment. Jesus shows up and God's presence is with them differently in this moment. But they're not, they're listening to Jesus' commands in this. And it's interesting though, right? Because up to this point in the storm, everybody's sort of freaking out. And I don't know if you've read through Matthew's gospel before, but it's like just a few pages ago, there was kind of the same situation. So just in Matthew chapter 8, like I'm wondering, why isn't it one of the guys are like, hey, settle down. We've been here before. Like for us, it's real easy. I mean, it's just a few pages back, like Matthew chapter 8, the disciples are in a boat in a storm and everybody's freaking out. Now this time Jesus is in the boat with them, but he's taking a nap and they're all worried about drowning, and someone finally wakes them up and Jesus has the same kind of interaction with them where he says, "Why are you of little faith?" And he calms the storm. I wonder, like, why did nobody remember that, right? Like, hey, chill, guys. We've been here before. Remember last time we were in the storm? Apparently, they're a lot like you and me. And they forget. We need to be reminded of Jesus' commands. But we have this I am moment, which leads us to our second point. How do you not drown in the storm of doubt? We need to focus on Jesus and not the storm. First, follow his commands. And then we need to focus on him, who he is. Think about this. Jesus as God in the flesh appears to them. Part of this show off of let me walk on water, you may struggle. If you're maybe not a Christian, you're kind of wrestling with faith. This is one of those stories you look at and go, see, that just doesn't happen. Like miracles don't happen. Somebody, and you have a challenge with that. But here you have God, the God who created the seas, the God who, if that's your challenge, let me give you a bigger challenge. That biblically we say there was nothing except God until God created everything just by his own force of power. And so here, you've got a pretty small miracle compared to that, where God's like, if I want to walk on the water for a minute, I'm going to do that because I can, right? And for the disciples, there's a realization that Jesus with them is worthy of their focus and their worship. So don't drown in the storm. We focus on Jesus, not the storm. Jesus is the source of our courage, right? Courage is not like the absence of fear, but it's a trust in God even through fearful situation. Courage is not found in the absence of the storm, but rather in the presence of Jesus. Why do we need to focus on God through the storm? We focus on Jesus. He's the source of our courage. His faithfulness, his presence with us is what gives us courage. All right, and so we get to this moment here, and this is like the first part of the story. Jesus shows up in the middle, and then I love part two. Part two goes from really cool to, this is just crazy from my perspective, what Peter does next. It says, Peter answered Jesus, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come on. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. Like, pump the brakes, hold on just a minute. That's really cool, okay? Can you imagine? First off, you're Peter in the boat and you're freaking out, and you go from worried that maybe you're gonna drown to, oh no, there's a ghost that's gonna torment us. This is terrible. That, oh, it's Jesus walking on the water. I don't know what it is with Peter's wiring. I kind of like wish I had a little bit of that. Where his mind goes next is, hey, if it is you, tell me to do it too, right? And then it's if that's not a crazy request, Jesus says, all right, come on out. The storm hasn't stopped. Like, what shifted for Peter? You go from afraid and in the midst of the storm and to suddenly like, I've got the faith that's going to trust Jesus and his commands, the presence of Jesus. I don't know what it was, but in that moment, something about the reality and his focus on Jesus, like Jesus' power became the thing that he focused on, not the waves' power. You have waves in your life, and I'm not saying they don't have power. I'm not saying your doubts aren't anchored in some real things. Some of our biggest experiential doubts isn't that we are thinking incorrectly. Like, we're worried about very real things. Like, the problems exist. The problems are real. In this story, the waves are real. The storm exists. And yet, Peter's focus on Jesus overcomes his fear of the storms. He steps out. I got to think like, man, for the rest of your life, how do you not want to just tell that story? You know, like work it into conversation. You know, I think like later on you're having some kind of dinner conversation and somebody's, you know, talking about something and any way that you can bring it back up, right? Like, so somebody, wasn't the beach cool today? Yeah, it really was. Those were cool waves. Hey, remember the time when I got to walk on water to Jesus? You're like, God, stop bringing it up, Peter, you know, but what an experience. Now, here's the thing though. This wasn't still the end of the story. We go from this, right? I am. How cool is this? We're going to do this. Wow. All right, this is my nerdiness. All right, the walk on water experience, right? So maybe some of you like right now, God just showed off in a really cool way in your life. Celebrate that, right? We don't have to be shy about that because it's not about us, it's about him, right? God just wowed you in some way. And maybe part of how you share Jesus is when that does happen, you help someone that doesn't know him yet connect the dots because you're not talking about your power and your strength and how cool you are. You're just wowed by God. And it's apparent in how you talk about that. Peter has this wow experience, and almost as quickly as it comes though, something happens. And we go from wow to drowning. Here's what was said again. Peter got out of the boat. He walked on the water. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Isn't that how our lives are at times? I mean, it just seems like sometimes at the turn of a dime, right? We can go from, wow, God, to why, God? I don't know why that is. But I trust the God who was the wow God, and when I was convinced he was with me there, do we trust him in this moment too? So what's interesting, I think we can look at Peter's faith and think this was faith, right? In here, like he stepped out of the boat and we can celebrate like that's the kind of faith I want to have. And there is something to that, like his faith in Jesus gives him courage to ask. You know, how cool is that? Like, and actually ask Jesus, did you catch that? Like Jesus doesn't initiate the idea. Peter says, hey, ask me to come out and I'll do it, right? We celebrate that faith, but you know what? Sometimes this is the reality of where we're at. And it's the same faith that led Peter to say, ask me to come out of the boat. That same faith when he's here is the Peter that puts his hand out when he's drowning and just cries out for Jesus to save him. That's our third point. When you get here, and I think we've all been here, don't bail out of the boat, cry out. How do we not drown in our doubt? We cry out to Jesus. And there are times in your life where that just may be the faith that you have right now. You just have a cry out faith. You feel in this situation. So can you not bail out on God and not quit on the faith? Because this is still not the end of the story. But when we're here, we're tempted, if you're anything like me, instead of crying out, we're tempted to bail out on God. And this is the experience I've seen from people in the church. I've seen from my friends where we get to these moments, and instead of continuing in the story this way, instead of doing what Peter did, where he reached out his hand, he cried out, and we have Jesus' hand. Instead of this, we're tempted to do this and just go back and give up on the faith. And our why God? Why if I'm following you, you told me to come out on the water, why am I drowning? Some of you have had that story. Like you're the one who challenged me to take this risk. You're the one who called us to Florida. You're the one who opened up a womb that was closed and we had our first child. You're the one who wowed us. Why now does it seem like you're absent from this situation? And so throughout the series, we're going to encourage you. Go to God with your why questions. Don't bail on the faith, but will you do something different instead? One of a great just picture of this is an Old Testament character named Jacob. And I want to actually read a verse for you that is very reminiscent of this words of Jesus where he says he's with them and help give you some context to like what it looks like to cry out to Jesus in the midst of that faith. And it's from Isaiah 41, 8 to 10. This is one of those many Old Testament passages where God says, I am this, that Jesus, when he says, I am this, they feel like the same thing. Read with me on the screen. Isaiah 41, 8 through 10. He says, but you, Israel, talking about God's people, my servant Jacob, this character Jacob was renamed Israel. Okay, so God's people named after this guy Jacob. He says, my servant Jacob, whom I have chosen, saying to you, you are my servant. I've chosen you and not cast you off. Catch these words. Fear not, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous hand. What I love about that name of Jacob in Israel, so you've got a guy, Jacob. I don't know if you know this. Some of you are newer to the church in the Bible, but there's a story where that man, Jacob, in the midst of a long life of challenge and back and forth, and God's calling him, and he's trying to do things, and he's wrestling. There's this encounter where Jacob wrestles with the angel of God in the desert at this pivotal point in his life. And on the other side of that experience of wrestling with God, God gives Jacob a new name. He names him Israel, which in the Hebrew that he names him sounds like, kind of means one who wrestles with God, one who wrestles with God. So throughout this series, we're going to ask you to be like Israel, to be like one who wrestles with God. I hope in this series there'll be some things that maybe some of the intellectual things that have been obstacles to you we can address, that experientially that we can address. But if nothing else, I really pray and hope that in this series that what will happen is we're going to take some time and we're going to allow God to answer us. We're going to bring our questions to him. You know, in the Old Testament, in the Psalms, there are so many Psalms that are this, like if you think of the posture of them, the person and the voice of one is like one who is like almost starts like this, right? There's this like almost just the anger, the fear, the why God. There's a prayer in these Psalms that are like angry fists directed toward God. That there's something that God is honored by that and desires that from us because you know what we're not doing? We're not doing this. when we get here, we're going to be tempted to just turn away from the faith and turn away from God. And instead, what God is asking us to do is to turn toward him with our questions and our wrestle. And I think there are times where we go from this, right, a why God, to this. And we trust him. And it's not always that we got an answer that was clear in between, but what we got, if we think back, we got a sense of who he is and his presence with us. Our focus wasn't so much on the storm, but it was on him instead. In our own family situation, I mean, there are times where we're still like, there's not just a switch to some of these changes. Like God is active and he's doing things, but, and my prayers for my son, there are times where it's just like, can you just do that? And make whatever, just heal whatever that is. But we haven't experienced that yet. We've got this. It's a wrestle. You got your wrestle. Will you take it to him and continue to bring it before him and trust him with it? If we continue the story with him, right, we go from Jesus' hand and Peter cries out and Jesus picks him up again. He pulls him out of the water. I love it. It says this, Jesus immediately, in verse 31, now immediately Jesus reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt? Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" You may read that, and I've done that through the lens of, like, is Jesus just beating the poor guy up? Like he's drowning, and then he's like, why do you have such little faith? I don't think that's Jesus' tone in that. And what if in this situation where Jesus led him to Peter to step that led to his fear, that led to drowning, and he cries out to Jesus, Jesus reaches out to him and pulls him out of the water and into the boat, but I don't think he's chiding him. I don't think he's making fun of him. I think he's developing him. If you think about it, there's some little pictures on the background that are, I just think, funny images. If you've been parents before, you've experienced something like trying to teach your kid to walk before. And it can be comical, right, for a baby to learn to take their first steps. And I just got this picture, like in preparing today, we've got this why God wrestle that Peter's in the midst of, and we might think, why allow me to go through that? And what if God in his goodness in ways that we don't always understand in the moment he's developing us and he's growing faith? That sometimes it is our faith grows as we step out of the boat. I think sometimes our faith grows on the other side of feeling like we're drowning and we cry out and he pulls us out of the water. But it's not unloving, right, for parents to allow a baby to stumble and try to learn to walk. They know that it's part of the journey. And so will you journey with us in the weeks ahead? Will you take your why God questions to God in the weeks ahead? Will we spend time and wrestle with him in our time ahead in the weeks ahead as well and keep crying out to him? Let's not bail out of the boat. Let's cry out. Peter's story doesn't end in this instance. He's going to have a lot of experience of this, right? He gets back in the boat and his story in the Gospels goes on. And it wasn't always easy. There's other encounters you read about with Peter where he's got the highs and the lows. He's identified Jesus and it's celebrated. He's getting kind of corrected by Jesus in other situations. After Jesus' crucifixion, the Gospels tell us that Peter doesn't understand it all, and in fear he denies Jesus. And that after Jesus' resurrection, that Jesus comes back to Peter again and kind of mends their relationship and has this discussion with them and gives Peter a chance to come back into the faith and to feel forgiveness from him of, I know you denied me, but he brings him back in. And there's this relationship of Jesus where as we trust him through the storms, through the waves, he's developing our faith and doing things in us. You know, at the end of Peter's life, from Christian tradition, Peter's martyred. He doesn't have what we would look at as like Americans and go, that's the positive end of the story. But here's a man who wrestled with Jesus, who was faithful to Jesus throughout his life. And he had these wow experiences, and he had these drowning experiences. You and I are going to have the same. Let's take our faith, let's take our questions to God. And one final thought for you is this. You can see this on the screen, that faith, the faith God gives. That's one of the things I love about this story. The faith God gives always goes the distance because it depends on him more than us. Think about this. If you think of Peter in the boat, Peter steps out of the boat. He's walking to Jesus. And it's like he doesn't quite make it. The fear strikes and he drowns. I said, though, the faith that God gives always makes the distance. You've got Peter on one end, Jesus on the other side, and he's walking toward him, and then he freaks out and he sinks. And he doesn't make it the distance, it looks like, right? Like it's like he started but didn't finish, but yet he does. Why? Jesus closes the gap. Like when he cries out, it's Jesus who picks him up. And this is our only hope in life and in death. Isn't that we're good enough? It's that Jesus, the source and the object of our faith, that he's going to close the gap, that we don't make it from point A to point B because our faith is so profound and never fails us, but because Jesus is so profound and never fails us. For some of you in the room, before you leave today, I would just encourage you this. From the big picture question of your life, when it comes to you and your hope for God forever, is it based on you, or is it based on him? Like Jesus as the object of your faith, is he your hope for how you're forgiven? Is he your hope for how you enter heaven? Is he your hope, what he has done for you in his death and his burial, paying the penalty of your sins, and his raising again to life again, and his now reigning and ruling? Is your hope in him or in you? And as we close and pray, I want to pray for those of you that maybe today you just need to say, Jesus, I've been trying to do this on my own and I just fail. I just need you. And you're in a cry out moment to Jesus. And so I want to pray for you. If you're here in the room and maybe you've been following Jesus even for years, but you're in a situation right now where you're like, I just need a cry out moment with Jesus. With every head bowed in this moment, if that's you, will you just take between you and God just a time and raise your hand to him as a please God cry out moment to him? And I want to pray for those of you that's you. Maybe you're here and it could be you, it could be a family question, concern. There's just this thing that you might feel like you're drowning and you just need to cry out to him. I see some hands in the room. You can put those down. Let me pray for you. Lord, I thank you for your presence. I thank you for your reality. And I pray for those in the room that are crying out to you, that they would hear you, feel you, and even if everything doesn't change, if the storm continues, they would know you're with them. And still with every head bowed, if you're in the room and maybe the reality is you've kind of been trying to figure out what it really means to follow Jesus, and maybe never before in your life have you committed your life to him, where you want to say today, like from this day forward, I just trust Jesus. Maybe before I've been trying on my own and I've had a different picture of him, but Jesus, if that's who you are, God in the flesh, who died on the cross for my sins, was raised again from the dead, I want you to have my life. I trust you for my future. If that's you, just again, heads bowed, otherwise in the room, will you just raise your hand? And if that is, I want to just take a moment and pray for you. See that hand in the back, and you pray. You can, if that's you, I encourage you, between you and God, you can pray silently, but the prayer may sound something just like this. It'll be just between you and him. Take a moment and say this. God, thank you. Up to this point, my life has not been perfect. There are things that I've done, there are things that have been done to me, and today, I just say thank you for dying in my place, Jesus. I know I'm not good enough on my own. I ask that you would come and live in me. Will you give me a new life from you today, a new start following you today? And from this day forward, the best I know how, I just say I'm yours. Teach me, lead me. My life is yours. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.